I'd like to ask the Minister for Policy and Reform what policy is in place for political members of departments with regard to the use of social media and electronic communications.
The Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. The electronic communications and social media policy and guidelines apply to all users who have access to the Isle of Man government electronic communication systems, government devices and personal devices enabled to do so when they are connected to the government network. This includes all individuals, whether employed on a permanent, part-time, temporary or locum basis, as well as third-party and contract staff. The policy goes on to say, quote, all elected members are to be made fully aware of the policy, standards and guidelines and of their responsibility to ensure privacy, confidentiality, security and appropriate use of electronic communications, unquote. The policy and guidelines set out the standards to follow when using social media, both in work and as an individual. With regard to the general conduct of political members of departments, this should also be considered within the context of the Government Code, which sets out the rules on collective responsibility. This does, for example, permit circumstances under which a member would have freedom to speak publicly against policies and decisions of a department. Thank you, Mr. President.
Supplementary message.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank the Minister for clarifying which policy is in place, because I don't think that ever gets issued to members when you first come into this chamber, so there might be a number of members that don't even know it exists. But just with regards to the Government Code, under Annex 2.2, members of Tynwald required standards of conduct. It actually states members of Tynwald. It doesn't specifically say if you're a department member, so I'd like him to clarify whether he thinks this is fit for purpose. And there's a number of items in there that all members need to make themselves very familiar and very aware with. So I'm just wondering whether the Minister would consider reviewing this policy and ensuring that political members are fully aware of what is in place. There's comments here, members of Tynwald should seek to maintain a constructive working relationship with other members, in particular attempt to resolve any difficulties, treat other members as Tynwald as honourable members, and I believe that under social media, the Chief Minister touched on it earlier with the very first question in this House today, that some items are in the media before they're discussed in this honourable court, and I think that it's incorrect and the policy needs to be strengthened.
Honourable Member, with the greatest respect, this is not a debate. No. You're making a lot of supplementary commentary. Important that we get a question so as to get a clear answer. Thank you,
Mr. President. I've asked the Minister, will he consider reviewing this policy and making sure it's fit for purpose? We instil it and we have approved a policy for members who are employed by the government. We need to make sure that members within this course are complying with it too.
Minister to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And I concur with the Honourable Questioner that it is important that members of Tynwald, like all other users of government services, when they're using those services, are aware of that document which I referenced in my original answer, and the Government Code, and all other policies that might or might not apply. And there's guidance in those documents about what to do to clarify whether those documents or any other documents or policies apply or do not apply. Secondly, I can confirm that there is a process ongoing to review the Government Code, and there's no reason why I can't ask the question whether or not that particular policy reference can be considered in that review. And thirdly, obviously as members of this Honourable Court, we do have a duty to keep ourselves up to date, and we also have a process of continuing professional development, and I'm sure the procedures inside Tynwald Court could consider any need for any focus on this issue in the future.
Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Will the Minister confirm, firstly, that the Government Code only applies to the government, it doesn't bind parliamentarians, which are covered under separate arrangements? Secondly, would the Minister ensure that there is adequate training in place for ministers and members of departments on all aspects that he's touched on, from policy, the Government Code and media use?
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'm reluctant in any way to get involved in the process in which I'm not involved. So I'm answering this question as the Policy and Reform Minister, a member of Honourable Court, about the guidelines that clearly, as I've stated, reference, in some sense, elected members. There are very good processes inside this Honourable Court, inside the standing orders, particularly inside Annexes 5, 6 and 7, from memory of the standing orders of the Tynwald Court. And I have been very involved over the last 2 or 3 years, as has the Honourable Speaker, in bringing forward proposals to improve those annexes and the standing orders. And I repeat, members of this Honourable Court do serve in government in various ways, and I've read out quite clearly a quote from a government document, and I'll leave it at that. I don't want to go beyond the scope of the question or beyond the scope of my competence in answering this question.
Honourable Member Mrs Beecroft.
Thank you, Mr President. Could I ask the Minister to clarify, and it's in relation to a statement made by a previous questioner, that a backbencher who is neither obviously a minister or in a department is certainly not paid by government.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr President. That seems to me to be the case, although obviously government uses public funds. The Tynwald Clerk, on behalf of this court, will bid for public funds, and when we get into the use of public funds, all these issues become very confusing. But as far as I recall, 6 members of this Honourable Court are not in government departments.
Final supplementary, Miss Edge.
Thank you, Mr President. I'd just like to ask the Minister, I think, following on from some of the questioning, it's quite clear that the Government Code, it states members of departments, and there seems to be a bit of confusion as to whether it applies to backbench MHKs, but that is the whole point of asking for this to be reviewed, because there's discrepancies in there and it does need review, and so I hope the Minister will take that on board.
A statement, not a question.